Hi everyone, my name is Jenny and I'm back today to do another video. Today I'm going to be chatting through all the 11 books that I finished in the month of January, so let's just get right into things. So as I said, I read 11 books in January. Of those 11 books, 10 of those books were written by women and 1 was written by a man. 5 of those books were written by white authors, 4 were written by black authors, and 2 were written by authors of Asian descent. 2 of the 11 books I read I listened to on audio, 4 of them were ebooks, and then 5 of those books were physical, all of which came from either my physical TBR or my ebook TBR in some way. In terms of age category, I read 1 middle grade book and then the other 10 books were all written for an adult audience. I also read 3 nonfiction books, and so the other 8 were all fiction, and primarily those fiction books were literary fiction, which is not surprising for me. So with all of those kind of stats out of the way, let's just get into the 11 books that I read, starting with the one I enjoyed the least and ending with the one I enjoyed the most. So starting with the book that I enjoyed the least, which is honestly one of the worst books I've read in a really long time. I should have DNF'd it, but I just continued reading it and that was probably a mistake. I gave this one 2 stars, but honestly maybe it'd be like a 1.5. It was really not a good time, and that was The Broken Spine by Dorothy St. James. This one I received as an early copy from Berkeley, which is an imprint of Penguin Random House, through NetGalley, and it came out on January 19th. This is a cozy mystery that follows our main character Trudell, or Trudy as she's known by her friends, who is a librarian who is very frustrated by her town's decision to transition the library to a completely digital collection, which in itself was kind of weird to me, was something that I did not particularly think made any sense, because I don't think libraries will transition to entirely digital collections anytime soon. There is just too much value in having print books. But my issues with the premise aside, that is what the book is about, and they have some reasons for this, but it's pretty shady just right from the get-go of the premise of the novel. And we follow Trudy as she is hoping to move all of the physical books into a secret library before they all get destroyed or sold, as the library is transitioning to this all digital collection. And so on the day of the grand opening of this like all digital library, someone dies. It takes place from there as Trudy kind of figures out who killed the person that died, as well as kind of other mysteries surrounding why the library went all digital, etc, etc. And I really just found everything about this to be terrible. I found the writing to be really bad. I did not think the characters were all that interesting or well drawn. I also found the setting to be pretty bland. It takes place in this small town in South Carolina, and I just like didn't really like the way that the setting was portrayed. It felt very much like an old-timey southern town, and I was like, that doesn't like vibe well with me. But primarily the reason that I really dislike this book is the plot and the way it progresses. I just found Trudy to not be that great of a detective like main character to follow. She's not really looking for clues necessarily. She's more just kind of along for the ride, and so there's not that much gain for the reader in terms of putting any investment into figuring out what actually happened, although at the same time what actually happened to me was pretty obvious. I also found that there were a lot of things explained about libraries, or like very cliche stereotypical things that were associated with libraries and librarians, that I just thought were pretty kind of poor writing choices. I also found there were a number of particular moments that just made me really roll my eyes, and so in the end, as I said, gave this only about 2 stars. Would not really recommend it unless you're like a huge fan of cozy mysteries, and even then I don't think you'd be satisfied by this one, just because the mystery itself was really lackluster, and this book in general just left a whole lot to be desired. Then moving into another book that I enjoyed but didn't necessarily love, we have American Eden by Victoria Johnson. This is a nonfiction book that I started way back in Nonfiction November and just finished in January. And as you can see from the subtitle, this one is about David Hosack, botany, and medicine in the Garden of the Early Republic. I listened to this one on audio, which I would perhaps recommend. I didn't love the audio narrator, but I think she's a pretty well-known audio narrator, so perhaps if you're more used to her voice, you would enjoy this as an audio experience better than I did. It was on Hoopla if you have Hoopla through your library. And so this is a nonfiction book, as it says on the subtitle, about David Hosack, who was a physician and botanist in the early years of the United States, so the late 1700s, early 1800s. He was a close friend slash the physician of Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton, as well as a number of other famous people around this time that are kind of more well known to history. And in this text, Victoria Johnson is attempting to kind of save David Hosack from the obscurity that he kind of lies within the American like cultural history. And I found this to be an engaging text. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff here, particularly about the like early development of New York City as a place of intellectualism here in the United States, as well as a place of a lot of kind of political machinations, especially early on in the Republic. I also found David Hosack to be like an interesting person with a lot of interesting theories and ideas that later got built upon by future botanists and people in the medical field. So I found those parts interesting. Victoria Johnson obviously did a lot of research into David Hosack as well as into this time, and that really comes through on the page. However, just because of the nature of archival records, particularly from this time, David Hosack is just like, there's not that much out there about him. And so a lot of this book ended up having to be about other topics that were like tangentially related to the thesis of this work. In fact, we'd for most of the chapters follow some other person during this time, whether that be Meriwether Lewis of the Lewis and Clark expedition or Aaron Burr, who we return to again and again. We'd follow them for like several pages doing absolutely nothing related to David Hosack, and then she'd like in a sentence tie it back to like maybe something that David Hosack was doing at that time, which I didn't particularly love given that I picked this book up to learn more about him, and I didn't feel like the book was largely about him. It was particularly drawing on Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr, which I can only assume is in part due to the like recent acclaim that Alexander Hamilton has because of Lin-Manuel Miranda's musical, as well as the pretty famous biography of Hamilton. So those aspects of this work really kind of drew it down for me, just because I did feel like she was trying to add more detail than was really necessary to tell the story of David Hosack and his impact on botany in America. So I will say though that the last chapter I think was probably my favorite, and that was in part because it talked about David Hosack's death, but then also the kind of greater impact that he had on New York. But I think the kind of nuances and minutiae that Victoria Johnson really was working with in this book just made it quite a boring book to get through, and just not one that had a lot of greater ideas to pull from to really get a kind of more generalized overarching look at this topic. Then another early copy that I read through NetGalley was We Run the Tits by Vendela Vida. This one is coming out on the 9th of February, this coming Tuesday, from Echo Books, and I gave this 3.5 stars. Honestly, I read this 2 or 3 weeks ago and I enjoyed it while I read it, but do not remember a ton about it, so that kind of says something about this book, I do feel. It was an engaging book. It's about a young girl who is living in San Francisco in the 1980s, so I think if you are someone who's from the Bay Area or grew up in the 1980s, you may get on with this book a bit better than I did. But it talks about her relationship with 4 of her best friends. However, some event happens that they all kind of remember a bit differently that causes our main character, whose name I don't quite remember, to kind of be ostracized from the rest of the group, and then kind of more dramatic stuff happens, and then the leader of the group actually goes missing. So there's kind of a mystery there as to what really happened to her. I think it's an interesting examination of like girlhood and growing up and the relationships that girls have with one another. It also reminded me a lot of The Lightness by Emily Temple, which I read last summer, and I actually really enjoyed it more, I think, than I enjoyed this one, but they read very similarly to me. So We Run the Tides kind of felt like something I'd read previously, but I did enjoy it. I think the writing style was engaging, and I definitely think if this is the type of book that you like, you would enjoy this one, but it's not going to be one that really sticks with me. Then the next 3 books that I all gave 3.75 stars, actually it's similar critiques for all 3 of them, so I'm going to talk about them kind of in tandem. The first of those was How Beautiful We Were by Imbolo Mbue, Girls Burn Brighter by Shobha Rao, and last but not least Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi. So all 3 of these books I think are written by very talented authors who are all pretty early on in their careers, and so I'm excited to see where their careers take them next. But for one reason or another, they didn't quite come together as novels for me. So How Beautiful We Were is about a small West African village in a country that could probably be analogous to Nigeria or perhaps Cameroon, which is where Imbolo Mbue is from, that has a corrupt leader that was put in place by the colonial power upon the country's independence. And we are following a small community living within this rural village that has an American oil company that's present within the community and the kind of surrounding area that have basically just utterly destroyed the land, the water, the air. So the community has a number of public health problems that are not being addressed by really anyone. And so this novel basically tracks the next 20 years, starting from an event that's like the first act of resistance all the way through to kind of see action and justice for this small village. I enjoyed this novel, and I actually have a whole review of this because this was for my African Women Writers Project, which I'll put a link to up in the cards above. But this novel, as well as Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi, I just felt kind of the plot was a bit lacking. So then Transcendent Kingdom by Gyasi is about a PhD student by the name of Gifty, who is Ghanaian American. So she was born in America, but her mother and her father immigrated from Ghana when they were in their young adulthood with her older brother Nana. And this follows Gifty as she is doing her research in neuroscience, understanding the pathways of addiction and how to potentially prevent addictive tendencies. And this research is in part inspired by, or very much inspired by, her brother's overdose in high school. He became addicted to opioids and later died of a heroin overdose when Gifty was quite young, only 10 or 11. And so this book kind of tracks those two timelines of Gifty in the present day doing her PhD research and Gifty growing up and ruminating on her childhood with her mother, who is very depressed, as well as her brother, who was an athletic kind of basketball star before he became addicted to opioids. So this has a lot of really great themes in here. There's themes of immigration and identity and the ways that those two things interact, as well as, of course, race and racism in America. And the intersection of immigration and racism in America is also discussed here, as well as the kind of ways in which drug addiction, particularly drug addiction in the Black community in America, is discussed by people kind of outside of those communities. And then there's also a huge discussion in here about the role of faith and God in people's lives and the intersection of faith and science. So there's a lot that's being tackled here, and I think Gyasi is definitely a talented writer. But with all three of these books, I kind of wish that the author had chosen to write this book at a later point in their career, as I think all of these books could have used something a bit more to really pull all of the themes that the author is trying to tackle here into a novel and not necessarily just kind of ruminations on all of these ideas. So that's Transcendent Kingdom. And then last but not least, Girls Born Brighter by Shobha is about two young girls living in India, and I would say probably the present-ish day, like early 2000s, I think, is when this novel takes place, that are very poor. They both live in basically a slum in a village in probably northwest India, if I'm remembering correctly, and the two of them have very little agency just because of the way that the patriarchy works there, but also because of their wealth status. And so one of them ends up in an arranged marriage with a man who is not necessarily abusive, but his mother-in-law is, but his mother, her mother-in-law, is very abusive. And then the other one actually ends up running away after being sexually assaulted by someone in their village. I'm not gonna give away who that is specifically. And so she ends up running away, and our kind of main character, whose name is Purnima, ends up going on an adventure that takes place over the course of several years to track down Savitha, her best friend from the village, who's been involved in like prostitution as well as kind of enslaved labor. So there's this discussion here on poverty and girlhood and the patriarchy and a lot of other kind of important themes. But as with these other two novels, there were elements of this, particularly the characterization of these two girls and their relationship to one another, as well as the ways in which the plot kind of progressed, that I didn't particularly love. So I think with all three of these novels, the authors are incredibly talented, and I'm really excited to see what they do next. And I think the ideas presented in each of these novels are really important ideas that I definitely would recommend checking out any of these three books just to read and kind of think about those ideas, but they didn't quite feel fully formed into a novel that kind of transcended beyond the themes that the author wanted to explore. So I gave them all 3.75 stars, would still recommend, but there were some critiques that I had of them, and so none of them could fully become favorites. And I think that may also be in part because I had really high expectations for all three of those books, and so just those expectations were not quite met, but they were still enjoyable, or at least very important reads. Then moving into my 4-star reads, I had two 4-star reads this month, the first of which was Dead Voices by Katherine Arden. This is the first book that I read this year, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. This is the second in Katherine Arden's middle grade horror series that each follows a different season. So the first one took place in the autumn, and now this one takes place in the winter at a haunted hotel, where our main character Ollie and her two best friends Coco and Brian are going with their parents to stay. They've been invited because I think they won a contest or something. I read this right at the beginning of the month, and January was a million years long, so I don't entirely remember. They're going to stay at this hotel that used to be an orphanage and then was a ski resort, and both of those things have kind of like sketchy reasons why they closed / are purported to be haunted. So the kids are kind of going in with some trepidation, and they see a like figure in the road on the way to the haunted hotel that kind of all frightens all of them, but their parents don't see it. And so then we kind of devolve into the kind of horror mystery plot of this one that I don't want to give too much away. But I really enjoy what Katherine Arden is doing here. I think the ways in which she's using kind of very real fears for middle grade readers of wondering what your friends actually think about you, the worries of losing a parent or the actual loss of a parent, as well as just kind of the fear of strangers and learning to trust people and who to trust, I think is all explored through the horror genre in really kind of important ways, and I definitely would recommend this to middle grade readers, although I do think it's pretty scary. Both the first one and the second one I was a little creeped out by, and I am an adult person. Granted, I am like a very easily scared adult person, so perhaps a younger person would not find this as frightening as I personally do, but I do really enjoy these ones, and I think they're bringing up really important topics, and would recommend to anyone who enjoys reading middle grade as an adult reader, or for someone who has like a middle grade reader in their life. I think these are really solid reads. Then the other 4-star book that I read this month was The Poppy War by Kuang. This is very well beloved on BookTube, so I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about what it's about, but it's an adult fantasy novel that pretty closely follows modern Chinese history, starting from around the early 1900s, I think, probably until the Cultural Revolution in 1949, although I have only read this first book, so I'm not entirely sure if the third book goes all the way until like the Cultural Revolution. But this story follows our main character Rin, who is an orphan who's from a rural part of, I don't even remember what this fictionalized China is called, but she's from a rural part of this country, and she longs to be accepted to the military academy that is called Singard, and she ends up taking the placement test and is accepted to the academy. So the first kind of third of the novel follows her at the academy, learning about military strategy as well as kind of some of the lore associated with the history of their country. There is some kind of mysterious elements of the lore that much of the populace has forgotten, but she does kind of get involved with the lore master, who teaches her more about gods and shamans and their role in previous wars as well as kind of in everyday life. But then about a third of the novel we actually kind of switch into an actual war that has broken out, and so Rin kind of gets involved in that. So it definitely is an epic military fantasy. If you are not a fan of reading about military strategy, wars, violence, gore, torture, I'd perhaps stay clear of this one, because Kuang definitely does not shy away from any of that. However, I think what I really enjoyed about this, because those are not topics that I necessarily like to read about, is the very kind of firm stance that Kuang is taking in this book and making through the character arc of Rin in discussing and exploring the ways in which war creates evil out of people, and how no one in a war is really doing the right thing. Everyone is making morally poor choices, and that's kind of the way that war works. And so I think this novel is really interesting in exploring and creating a character who is incredibly morally gray and who doesn't think about the kind of impacts of what she's doing and the role that that has on other people's lives. She's very selfish in a lot of ways, which I think is really interesting. Definitely not a character that I read a lot from, and I think Kuang does a really good job of creating this nuanced character, although I did have some critiques in terms of understanding her like motivations, which I think are explained by the end of the novel into what she will likely want to do in the future. But at the beginning I didn't fully understand why she was so interested in attending the military academy, because her past has not been like quite fully explored, but I'm hoping it'll be explored in later books. I also found the other characters to be really enjoyable, and there are many kind of humorous moments in this. I'm not sure if other people found this funny, but there were definitely moments that I found to be really sassy and witty that I really enjoyed. And this book also had me looking up a lot about the Sino-Japanese War as well as the history of Taiwan, both of which are included in the kind of history that is being referenced in this text. And so I appreciated that, as well as I always appreciate a book that encourages me and welcomes me to research a period of history that I don't know a lot about. And this book definitely had me doing that, so I could understand the greater context of kind of what Kuang was pulling from. So I would recommend this one if you are willing to go to very dark places with your characters and really think about war in a very critical way, and to enjoy reading fantasy. I definitely think you would enjoy this one. Obviously it's very well beloved here on BookTube, so I am not the only person out there recommending it, but I did enjoy it and will probably continue on with the series at some point. I'm not in a huge rush to do so, but I may try to do it before the end of the year if possible. I then had two 4.25-star reads this month, the first of which was Visionary Women: How Rachel Carson, Jane Jacobs, Jane Goodall, and Alice Waters Changed Our World by Alice Barnet. This was another one that I started in 2020. I started this in December and was hoping to read it for the Reading Women Challenge, but didn't get around to finishing it. But this is a collection of 4 mini biographies of these 4 women, all of whom I was familiar with prior to reading this book, and that's in large part why I was interested and learning more about their personal lives. And I thoroughly enjoyed this. I think all 4 of these women are really important figures to their respective fields, and I appreciate that Andrea Barnet has kind of highlighted their work in this book. I did find that the biographies kind of got less and less strong, in my opinion, as the book went on. They're ordered in this book in the same way they're ordered in the subtitle, and I definitely found Rachel Carson's to be the strongest biography. However, that may also be because I find Rachel Carson to be perhaps the one with the largest influence on present day, particularly in areas that I have like studied or have interest in. But she also just had a very interesting life that I think had a lot of burdens that made her work difficult to do, and so I think the impact that she still had is all the more impressive because of everything that happened in her life. I also enjoyed Jane Jacobs. I think learning more about the ways that she got involved in her work that were very much kind of community driven was really interesting, and also learning about how her book The Death and Life of American Cities kind of came to be, which is a book that I've read and thoroughly enjoyed. Definitely had a huge impact on me and my thinking. I will say I did find Alice Waters' biography to be the weakest of the collection, and as some other reviewers have said, I'm not entirely sure that it was necessary to include her in this text. I do find Alice Waters to be an important figure, and I think perhaps her impact has not been fully realized, or her impact in the kind of work that she was doing was also being mimicked by other people at the same time, and so she does not seem as singular as some of the other women do in terms of helping Americans to realize what was wrong with the kind of sustainable agricultural system of the 1950s and 60s. But I also found that there was a lot more kind of personal anecdotes from Alice Waters' life that I found a lot less interesting than the personal anecdotes from any of the other ones, and I just felt there was a lot of kind of relationship drama that was included in this book that didn't really feel super necessary or relevant to her like work as a visionary woman. So for that reason, I didn't particularly love her section, and I kind of wish that it had been like cut down, just because I think there was a lot of kind of anecdotal stuff that was not as relevant. But overall, if these 4 women are women you are interested in or want to learn more about, I definitely would recommend checking out this nonfiction work. Then the final e-arc that I read this month was Milk Blood Heat by Dantiel Moniz. This actually is already out from Grove Atlantic. It came out on February 2nd, and I gave this one also 4.25 stars. I thoroughly enjoyed this one. This is a debut short story collection, and I think Dantiel Moniz is definitely very talented, and I'm very excited to see what work she does next. Usually in a short story collection there are some duds, but honestly I enjoyed pretty much all of the stories in here. There were a couple that were from a male perspective that I didn't think worked quite as well, but a lot of the stories touched on similar themes, and I think when she came back to those similar themes, she really shined as a short story writer. My favorite of this collection was the story Necessary Bodies, which honestly I would recommend reading this collection for this story alone. It's honestly one of my favorite short stories that I've read in quite a while, and this short story follows a young woman who has just learned that she is pregnant. She has a long-term committed partner. She's in an established like monogamous relationship, but she's not yet told him nor anyone else. Her mother is very interested in having a grandchild, so she's been kind of eager to learn that her daughter is expecting. But this short story is kind of just exploring the woman's thoughts on having a baby and kind of bringing a baby into the world given everything that is happening with like political instability, climate change, global environmental change, global social change, all of these kind of uncertainties that we are currently experiencing in our world, and what bringing a baby kind of means when you know and care about all of these issues. I thought that was really well done. I thought it was a really great use of a short story to kind of think about these ideas and like establish her thought process over the couple of days as she kind of considers what this means and whether she wants a baby and what that also means and whether she wants to be a mother. I thoroughly enjoyed that story, definitely would highly recommend. But there were several other stories as well that also dealt with themes of pregnancy, motherhood, also like menstruation and puberty are also discussed a lot in these stories, and I think all of those themes are ones that Dantiel Moniz writes about in really interesting and thought-provoking ways, so I would recommend this short story collection if those are themes that interest you. The final book that I wanted to talk about is my 1 5-star read of the month, which was Stamped from the Beginning by Ibram X. Kendi. This is also one that I started in nonfiction November and just did not get around to finishing until this month, and I absolutely love this. I think it should be required reading for all Americans, and I think this is so important, so valuable, and really well done. This is a really readable text about a lot of really complex ideas, and I'm always impressed when reading Ibram X. Kendi's writing, whether it's in kind of a longer form like this or in his Atlantic articles, of the ways that he really kind of lays things out in very clear ways despite the complexities that are kind of present within discussing themes of like racism and white supremacy. So this one, as it says on the subtitle, in case you're not familiar, is the definitive history of racist ideas in America, and it is exactly that. It starts in the early 1600s with the arrival of the first African slaves to the continent in 1619 and goes all the way until basically the present, if I'm remembering correctly. I think he published this book first. Yes, he published this book first in 2016 prior to Trump's election. And this copy, I think the paperback edition, I'll include like a little foreword to the book that talks about President Trump's election and his thoughts on it, and kind of how he was not surprised by Trump's election given his kind of work understanding the pushback of racism to any like progress made in terms of racial equity. So this book kind of tracks that progress and anti-progress throughout America's history. I will say 2 critiques of this work, but neither of which were so detrimental that I like lowered my rating. But this book is split into 5 key historical figures, and honestly I'm not sure that Kendi needed that framing in this book. So the book follows these key historical figures who are kind of meant to represent the prevailing theory of anti-racism at the time that that person was alive. So we follow Cotton Mather, Thomas Jefferson, William Lloyd Garrison, W.E.B. Du Bois, and Angela Davis. We begin each subsection with like an introduction to this person, when they're born, and kind of learn more about them and their thoughts, and then we end each section with them. But there were sometimes entire chapters where we didn't even mention what that person was doing, and so at times I felt like it was a framing device that wasn't entirely necessary, particularly given that these 5 people also represent what is, in my mind at least, as an American person who studied history and has an interest in it, 5 very clearly defined periods in American history of prior to the American Revolution, the early Republic, the years before the Civil War / around the Civil War, early 1900s, and then kind of the present day civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. Like, I feel like those are pretty well defined times that didn't necessarily need a specific person. Well, obviously those 5 people had a lot of influence on the history of racist ideas, so I understand also why he included them as kind of these leading key figures during that time. At times I was kind of wondering like, oh, what is that person doing, because we haven't heard from them in like 20 or 30 pages. I also found, just because of the sheer amount of information and the kind of project that Ibram Kendi is hoping to accomplish in this book, that we would often return to different kind of themes that got brought up at a number of different points throughout the book, but were not kind of tied together as a like steady stream of history of like medical racist ideas, but instead kind of a history of racist ideas of certain time periods. And we periodically jump to like racism in education, racism in medicine, racism in politics, and there was not kind of a through line through all of those things. And I kind of wish there had been, just because sometimes it was difficult to remember what he had previously talked about. This became especially clear to me in terms of medical racism and talking about pre-Civil War time period and how enslaved people were used as like medical patients there, but then also talking about the Tuskegee experiments in the 1900s. There wasn't a like tie between those 2 events to see kind of clear progression, which I kind of wish had been more clearly tied together, such as like perhaps each chapter would have been focused on a particular aspect of racism, as opposed to kind of the more linear timeline that this book uses that kind of forces it to jump around between different ideas. I understand why he didn't do that, but I do wish those kind of through lines had been made a bit more clear. But other than that, I still fully enjoyed this. I think it's super important reading and would definitely highly recommend if you have not already read it. So those are the 11 books that I finished during the month of January. I've already finished 2 books since February started. It's the 6th right now, so I think I'm going to be doing a mid-month wrap-up, in part because I don't remember a lot of these books as well as I really would like to. So I think I'm going to go back to doing mid-month wrap-ups and end-of-the-month wrap-ups as I was doing back in like the summer, early fall, just because I do think that's a better way for me to kind of remember what it is that I wanted to talk about with each of these books. If you have read any of these books and want to talk to me about them down in the comment section below, please do. Additionally, if you are new to my channel, I'd love to have you stick around and subscribe, and I will talk to you next time.